So good evening and happy Earth Week. My name, and thank you for joining Williamsburg Presbyterian Church tonight for our Earth Care Talk. My name is Tom Mao. I'm the moderator of Williamsburg Presbyterian Church's outreach ministry. Our outreach ministry has 8 teams, one of which is the Earth Care team. And the Earth Care team is led by Dorothy Geyer, who is on with us tonight. Our church has been an Earth Care congregation of the Presbyterian Church since 2013. And the team conducted a survey last year, and based on the results of that survey, has decided to focus on the health of the Chesapeake Bay this year. So this is the kickoff event for our year, and we are planning a number of activities this year, but the only one I'll mention now is that our next event will be participating in Clean the Bay Day on Saturday, June the 5th. So I'd like to introduce Tara. Our speaker tonight is Tara Rudo. She is a marine education specialist with the Chesapeake Bay National Estuary Research Reserve, Virginia. Tara was born and raised in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She received her master's degree in environmental science from UNC Wilmington, where she focused on marine and coastal education. During her program, she interned as a sea turtle monitor at the North Carolina National Estuary Research Reserve on Masonboro Island, and worked for UNCW Marine Quest as a marine science educator. After graduation, she completed an AmeriCorps service term in the education department at the Georgia Sea Turtle Center. Her passion is educating the public on how they can become environmental stewards and help their local community, and she hopes that through her current position, she can help to inspire a passion and sense of exploration for the Chesapeake Bay region. I now turn the program over to Tara, who will speak about the Chesapeake Bay ecology and impacts.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for having me this evening. As I was saying earlier, I'm really excited. Usually I'm teaching children and doing school programs, so I'm excited to speak with the public and adults. It's a very refreshing thing for me. But as Tom mentioned, yes, I am a marine education specialist at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuary Research Reserve in Virginia. I can't even pronounce it today. You might hear me say CBNIR for short. But before we do dive into today's topic, I do want to tell you a little bit more about where I work. So we are part of the National Estuary Research Reserve System, which is federally funded through NOAA. And there's 29 different sites that are located all throughout the United States. And our overall mission pretty much for all of these sites is on the education and protection and restoration of wetlands and estuaries. And even though an estuary in the Pacific Northwest is going to look very different than, say, in Hawaii, we, again, still have that same mission in mind. And again, we're located in the Chesapeake Bay. There are 2 Chesapeake Bay offices, one in Maryland and one in Virginia. So the office here in Virginia, we're housed over at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. And we have 4 different departments. So I'm working in our education, doing field work with students, doing summer camp programs, field trips. All of that has been virtual over the last year. We have our coastal training program and our stewardship team. So they're more congregating with local organizations, politicians, and the general public and adults. And then we have our research team. So they're the ones out getting down and dirty. They're up to their knees in marsh mud. You might see them on the York River or the Rappahannock River on our boats, collecting data to bring back to our lab. So even though we're a pretty small team, we get a lot done throughout the year. And I do just want, I'm sure all of you know probably a lot more about the Chesapeake Bay than I do, since I've been here for about a year. But a little background about the basics of the Chesapeake Bay, specifically the watershed. So this image here shows how massive our watershed is. 6,400 square miles, close to 12,000 miles of shoreline. So that's not just the Chesapeake Bay itself, that's all the rivers and the creeks and little tributaries located up even into Pennsylvania and New York. And there's 6 different states within our watershed. So even if you live hundreds of miles from the Chesapeake Bay itself, the impacts of your daily life have an impact on the Chesapeake Bay because you live within this watershed. And this number is still growing. There's approximately 17 million people within this watershed. I believe right now it's almost close to 18, more people moving to this area. So it's really important that we do talk about the Chesapeake Bay because it is a very massive watershed and it's a very important body of water in general. If we were to look just at the Chesapeake Bay Estuary itself, so the Chesapeake Bay Estuary is the largest estuary here in the United States, and it holds an average of 15 trillion gallons of water. And I was like, well, how much water is that really? So it didn't really help, but it's about 227 million Olympic-sized swimming pools of water just in our Chesapeake Bay. So that's a lot of water. Even though that's a massive amount of water, it's not actually very deep. So pretty much the average depth is around 20 to 21 feet. The deepest point in the bay is up near Maryland. I believe it's 150-ish feet, but it's relatively shallow throughout the bay. And even though we have 5 main rivers that drain into the bay itself, there are other small rivers and tributaries that drain into the bay as well. So we're not just getting water from the ocean, the Atlantic, we're also getting it from inland. And there's a lot of biodiversity in the bay, 3,600 species. So that includes plants and animals. And I'll show you some of the common iconic species that we find in just a moment. And as we were just talking about earlier about oysters, there's a lot of seafood pulled from the Chesapeake Bay. So the bay itself produces around 500 million pounds of seafood per year. Primarily, that's going to be oysters and blue crabs. Those are the common fisheries located in the bay. But again, the bay just provides a lot of services for us. So it provides a lot of jobs. You have your watermen, you have educators like myself, you have scientists. There's a lot of revenue that comes from the bay, especially from those fisheries. And of course, we all love, kayaking, canoeing, fishing, all of the recreational activities that come along with living on a beautiful coastline and a beautiful bay. So again, a large watershed and a large estuary, and it's very important that we talk about some of the issues of the Chesapeake Bay itself. So I'm just going to touch on some of the iconic species when we talk about biodiversity. So when we talk about plants, probably the most prominent is Spartina Alterniflora. So if you've been out in the marshes, you see all that cordgrass everywhere. So it's a salt tolerant cordgrass. So it's really abundant in marshes. And on that cordgrass, you'll see the little periwinkle snails. They'll climb up and down to escape the rising tide. We have our lovely eastern oysters. We love those. So they're a common species. They're filter feeders, so they're extremely important to protect. And we'll even find some crab species. We know about our blue crab, but usually when I'm with kids, we find fiddler crabs everywhere. So it's a really common crab species that we find. But we don't want to forget about some other important species, some bird species that are common, great blue herons and osprey, which are one of my favorites. VIMS actually has a camera set up where you can watch. We have ospreys that come onto a nest. And so we always have a camera pointed at it. So they just returned from migrating. So they're back on their little perch. So we're starting to watch them again. We have horseshoe crabs. They come in and spawn during the warmer months. You usually see them more up in the Delaware Bay though, but still a Chesapeake Bay species. And then my personal favorite are the adorable diamondback terrapins. So they're a type of marsh turtle. And the females will emerge during the summer to lay their nests. And CB NEAR does a lot with protecting those nests and ensuring that they're not getting predated by things like foxes and raccoons, which is very common out, say, on Goodwin Islands in the mouth of the York River. And then finally, some of the common fish species that we find. So I really love, the sea robins. They get their name because they have those wing-like fins. We find a lot of seahorses. They like to hide in a lot of the seagrasses and the seagrass beds that are located throughout the bay. The iconic northern pufferfish, and we have striped burrfish as well. You'll see them puffing up. And then one I didn't really know about, so I moved here, were skillet fish. So they are a small fish species, but they have a suction cup on the bottom, and they can actually stick to things like this plexiglass here, or even to things like the hull of our boats. So when we pull up gear, it's really hard to get them removed. They're pretty strong, but that's just a little taste of some of the abundancy of the animals and plants that we find in the Chesapeake Bay. And if you guys have any questions at this point, feel free to ask. I was going to move into some of the impacts of our bay next. So if you guys have any questions, you can throw it in the chat, or you can come off mute if you like.
I had a question about the turtle nest protection that you talked about. Are there specific species that you all are focusing on protecting, or is it basically any turtle nest that you find or that someone reports? How does that work?
So when it comes to things like sea turtles, we are not permitted to work with sea turtles at the reserve or even at VIMS. So that is going to be the Virginia Aquarium. They deal with sea turtles, and the Department of Natural Resources as well. And that's usually the case in a lot of states. At Chesapeake Bay Reserve, we are only protecting diamondback terrapin nests. So they're very easy to tell apart, and even their nests too. And so what we'll do is when we find a nest, we'll, just like you do a sea turtle nest, we put a little mesh cage over it. We just don't use signage like we do with sea turtles. But that's the only turtle species that we deal with, because from my experience working with sea turtles, it's a lot of permitting and a lot of red tape to go through. So anytime there is a stranding or any kind of sea turtle activity, that is not reported to VIMS or to CB NEAR. We redirect that to the proper authority. But yeah, it's a good question though.
Hi, I have a question. Well, two. One, the Osprey camera.
Yeah.
Where is that located? Is that right at VIMS, or is that?
So the live feed is going to be on YouTube, and after this presentation, I can actually put it in the chat link for you guys, so you guys can watch that. But it's the constant cam, but the post with the nest is at VIMS. So like, even though from my office I can see it, if you want to watch from home, you can watch from YouTube. And again, I'll throw that in the chat for you guys afterwards.
Yeah, we've been watching that, so that's really exciting. The other one is the turtles that I find kayaking up the tributaries, like College Creek or Powhatan Creek.
Yes.
This time of year, normally if they're sunning, you can't get anywhere near them. As soon as they hear you coming, they fall back in the water. But
Yes.
it seems like, I'm thinking, as they're really cold and they're in the sun, this time of year, you can get really close to them. In fact, I thought one of them was dead. I got so close before he left.
Yeah, they will definitely bask sometimes in the sun. And you will see terrapins, they do stick their head up a little bit out of the water. And yeah, as soon as you like put one paddle in the water, they're gone. They're really hard to get close to. Most of the time you'll see them on land. Most of the time it's going to be during the summer. That's when your best chance to see the whole turtle itself is going to be during the summer. And you won't really find terrapins crossing roads or anything. They're going to be staying in those tidal creeks and those marshes. But yeah, they can be a little skittish for sure. But I'll go ahead and keep going. So I'll talk about a few of the impacts to the Chesapeake Bay, and there are many, like a lot of different coastal areas, but there are human impacts and natural impacts to the bay. So I've listed a few of them here that we're just going to touch on briefly. So the first being climate change. So as global temperatures begin to climb, it does affect our waterways, and especially when it comes to things like sea level rise. So of course, it's not a large increase at one time, but it is that subtle, half an inch every couple of years. But over time, what you start to see is Unfortunately, Chesapeake Bay is a very flat, low-lying land. So anytime there's any kind of sea level rise or say a storm event, flooding is a huge problem here. And so if you take away a lot of that land due to sea level rise, you're going to see a lot of these species being displaced. They won't have that habitat, so they'll have to migrate or move to a different location, but this tends to be a more gradual process over time. We also experience ocean acidification because our ocean and our waterways are a carbon sink, so they're great at absorbing excess carbon from the atmosphere, but sometimes that's not a good thing because it increases the acidity of the water. So things like oysters, their shell can start to degrade and become weaker over time. So that can affect the species and then affect the fisheries, and then we're not able to eat oysters anymore. So that can be a problem. And then also a change in migration patterns for certain animals. So I mentioned our osprey, they just migrated back to this area. So if temperatures begin to change more severely, we might see that they come back earlier, or they might come back later, or they might not even come back at all. So a lot of these animals, their cue to migrate is temperature. So if the temperature is thrown off, their migratory pattern is thrown off and their habitat might change as well. Something I've done a lot of work on is, of course, pollution. So that's the presence of any kind of harmful substance into the, I almost said the atmosphere, into the environment. It can be the atmosphere too. And when we talk about pollutants, we're really talking about two types. So point source pollutants and non-point source. Point source pollutants are really easy. We can just point to it and say, that's where the pollutant is coming from, like a pipe dumping out waste. And it's really easy to solve that problem because you know where the pollutant's coming from. Something that a lot of environmental scientists are focusing on is non-point source. And that's because we're not sure where these pollutants come from. So if you have a river, for instance, like the Mississippi River, you have farms and factories and cities and neighborhoods and all of these things along the river that produce things like excess sediment and phosphorus and nitrogen and chemicals into the water, and that drains down into the Gulf of Mexico, and we see a giant dead zone there. And even though we know these pollutants and we kind of think we know where they came from, it's hard. You can't directly identify where they came from. So that's why they're really dangerous, is because it's like that out of sight, out of mind mentality. It's like, we know there's pollution, but it's hard to fix it because we don't know the source of it. So a lot of the things we'll talk about has to do with non-point source pollutants. Overfishing has become a problem in the Chesapeake Bay, especially when it comes to the State of the Bay report, which we'll talk about. So anytime you hear the term overfishing, it's basically catching too many fish. And they become too depleted, that population, and they don't have time to reproduce and recover those numbers. And the easiest way to manage this is through fisheries management. And that's through conservation. So that's determining how many of a species you can catch at a time. And then allocation is who can catch what. You have to have certain permits and certain equipment to catch certain species, or you can only, go blue crabbing from May until July. So they set these very distinct rules to ensure that overfishing a certain species doesn't become a problem. And that has become a problem in the Chesapeake Bay for not just one species, but quite a few over the last 50 years. Another common problem that has occurred in the Bay has to do with disease. And so this isn't a huge problem now as it was back in the 50s and 60s. Scientists discovered 2 different types of parasites in the Bay. These were discovered in other places before the Chesapeake Bay, but these will actually target oysters. And dermo is one that actually targets the oyster in their 2nd year of life. And MXX targets all ages of oysters, which makes it a little more dangerous. But it's able to target the shell of the oyster and the actual muscle of the oyster. And it can create a really deformed oyster, a weaker oyster. It can even potentially kill them and cut their growth rate in half or deplete it completely. But luckily, with a lot of research, these are not really an issue in the bay anymore, but there are scientists that focus on ensuring that these diseases aren't going to appear again. Most of them are caused by pollution and by temperature changes. So we definitely need to make sure we're regulating that so these diseases don't emerge again. And VIMS played a large role in a lot of the dermo research for the eastern oyster, especially in the York River and the Gloucester Point and Gloucester area. I think this is my last one for some of the issues are harmful algae blooms. If you guys are interested, tomorrow night, we're actually having a discovery lab. It's a program we have where we're going to be talking about harmful algae blooms, or HABs for short. And these occur when large colonies of algae will basically produce out of control. And sometimes they can produce a toxin that can be harmful to a lot of the local wildlife, and potentially it can be harmful to people. Not always, but sometimes it can be. So sometimes you'll see these signs like beaches closed, no swimming, or you might see there's a harmful algae bloom, or some sort of signage saying you don't want to go in the water right now. It's not going to kill someone, but it can cause, if you have a cut on your skin, can cause some irritation or infection. And it's just not healthy to be in the water at that point. And they usually occur more during the summertime or the late spring when it's really warm. And we've been able to predict when these events occur, because they do happen all over the country, but they are really common here in the Chesapeake Bay. And they vary in color. Some are that greenish color, some are red tides. We've all heard about those. Even bioluminescent blooms are considered algae blooms. So those are the ones during the summer where you hit the water at night and it lights up blue. So that's all those dinoflagellates producing at once. If you've never seen one, I guarantee you'll see one during the summer in this area. They are everywhere during the summertime. But algae blooms, again, can be harmful to wildlife, depletes the dissolved oxygen and can starve out a species. So scientists do a lot of work to help predict when these events are going to occur. So before I hop into the State of the Bay report, I was going to open up if you guys had any more questions before I move on.
I actually had one again.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
I'm interested in the harmful algal blooms that you actually were just talking about. One thing that I always learned is that like those algal blooms like that were caused by nutrient runoff and excess nutrients that cause the algal bloom. But you mentioned they could be predicted. Is there something else that's causing them besides excess nutrients?
So most of the time it is, like you mentioned, excess nutrients. And so that is one way that they're able to predict it, is since we do monitor and do a lot of water quality sampling, we can basically map the trends. And especially if there's like a large rain event or a large storm, scientists know like, hey, there's going to be a lot of runoff and a lot of nutrients and a lot of pollutants, and that can easily spark a HAB event. It's easy to kind of predict them. The thing I was going to ask tomorrow night with our guest speaker is, well, you can predict them, but what can you do to like stop them, I guess, but you can't really stop them. When it can be affected by temperature as well. So if there is a really, really hot summer, like this past July, I believe we had a week of 101 degree days. I remember, and I began hearing a lot in the news about these small blooms occurring. So if you have an extreme temperature change like that, an extreme temperature change, you can see that it will deplete a lot of the dissolved oxygen in the water, and that can cause a HAB event to kind of appear out of nowhere. But they can also disappear, as quickly as they did come. So mostly when they're predicting these events, it does have to do with water quality sampling and measuring that. And then really a lot of the forecasting when it comes to things like storms, because they know that's going to be a huge trigger for sure. Good question.
Tara, do you know where the ospreys winter?
I actually don't know. I think they do migrate I know I've seen them down in like the Georgia area when I've been down there during more of the colder times of the year. They will migrate, of course, they're moving south because it's going to be warmer during the winter time. In Florida, they do see them some as well, but mostly I think it's right on that Georgia-Florida line is usually when they kind of stop there. But they are a coastal bird species, so you don't see them really inland or anything. They're going to stay pretty close to the shoreline, but I would say about maybe Georgia, Florida. Mhm.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
What, yeah, the overfishing, and it gets into the politics, I guess, too. The politics of trying to manage overfishing. And that's is it how do you pronounce it? Menhaden?
Menhaden, yeah, Menhaden.
Is that still overfished? And does that show where the politics are?
I love that you mentioned that because we were going to talk about that a little
well,
later.
We can talk later then.
Yeah, because Menhaden used to be one of the biggest fisheries here in the Chesapeake Bay about 40, 50 years ago. And a lot of people today did not know that. And they are an extremely overfished species. Their population has gone down quite a bit. And a lot of it does come down to, the politics of things. And especially in the Bay, you have different states. Like, for instance, Virginia and Maryland, we share a lot of the Chesapeake Bay coastline. So you have two governments, trying to work together along with the federal government to, agree on one thing for, say, one type of fishery. So it is tough because a lot of it has to do with policy and regulation. And the Menhaden population is beginning to rebound a little bit, but not as much as it used to be. So unfortunately, hopefully in the near future, we can kind of all get on the same page fishery wise. And there's been a lot of bad press in the news. I know there was a documentary recently on Netflix about, I watched it myself. It's about sustainable fisheries in the world. And they make some good points. They really like to attack just Asian fisheries and not really focus on the global fisheries around the world. And some fisheries are really doing great things with creating sustainable seafood. And creating legislation. But we also have to think, there are certain populations that, require certain species where other countries can be a little more selective. So it's definitely a tricky topic, especially after that came out for people to talk about. But I think there are such things as sustainable fisheries. It's all about things in moderation. And the Chesapeake Bay does a great job with, like I said, conservation and the allocation of certain fisheries, especially our oysters and our blue crabs. So hopefully some of the other fisheries will come along soon.
How do you gauge the population of different types of fishes and things in the bay?
It's tricky. So there's a lot of different ways that it's done. So it's not as easy as like we go out and we count, how many fish we see when we're like scuba diving, right? So a lot of it's done through fish surveys and trawls. And so, and you don't get just a target, you don't guess how many is in a year. You can't count a species within a year. It usually takes multiple years to gain an understanding of how abundant that species is in the bay, but most of it is done through calculations through trawl surveys. And so, for instance, VIMS, they have a fisheries department who specifically does that, who they're out trawling for fish, not for consumption of fish, but for scientific purposes. So doing fish surveys as a way for them to kind of estimate the population. And you can also look at, say Manhattan, they get eaten a lot by things like striped bass. So if you see less striped bass, you're probably going to think that there's less food for them to eat, so less Manhattan. So looking at another fish, we can kind of estimate what the other fish population might be like. But a lot of it is going to be done over a couple of years through those surveys. And with that kind of transitions perfectly into the State of the Bay report. So this is something that is not done through CB NEAR. So I'm kind of speaking on the behalf of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So this is a way for us to give a comprehensive measure of how healthy the Chesapeake Bay is. It's usually conducted every couple of years. So they just did the 2020 report. And they're looking at 13 different indicators. And those are going to be within pollution, habitat, and fisheries. Those are the three main topics. And these scientists that they hire are going to be looking at each indicator within those topics and assign them a score, 1 through 100. So 1 is pretty low grade up to 100. And these give us a basic, general grade. If you had a report card for the Chesapeake Bay for 2020, unfortunately, it was a 32, which is a D+. So this has been going on since 1998 that they've been doing this report. And so if we look at a trend from 1998 to 2020, this is what it looks like with the State of the Bay report. It used to be done every year, but I think around 2010, they started doing it every 2 years. It's gone up, it's starting to improve. It did slump down a little bit, and we're pretty much been holding steady since 2016-ish. And the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, their goal is to achieve a score of at least 40 by 2025. And a score of 40 is approximately a C. So that's not, great, but it's definitely an improvement from where we are now. And so some of the challenges that have been, causing these scores to fluctuate so much, there's two main things. The first being the political atmosphere at the time. And I really hate talking about politics with the environment, but unfortunately, legislation and policy have a lot to do with environmental change a lot of the time. So if you have legislation that is not very helpful to the environment, you're going to start to see changes with that. I know there were a lot of rollbacks with the previous administration and not helping the wetlands, especially. There was a lot of clean water rule rollbacks from the Obama era that were kind of terminated over the last 4 years. And so if we don't have our federal government thinking very eco-friendly, it's hard for our state and federal governments to do the same because of funding. And like I mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we have 6 different states. So that's a lot of state governments trying to work together and trying to get on the same page, because, that's very difficult to do. And especially if some of those people have different opinions on certain topics, say they're like, well, our Maryland crab population is fine. Well, our Virginia one isn't. You're going to have some issues there. And a lot of that comes down to funding as well. So if you don't have the funding available, it's hard to implement these projects to help the environment. And so if we look specifically at the 2020 report, so this is what it looks like. So for the pollution indicators, you have 4 different categories. We have the nitrogen and phosphorus, which are usually caused again by excess sediment that pollutes down into the waterways. And so they've actually improved from that. So we're seeing less of those chemicals in the water. There's still some there though. Dissolved oxygen, so that is going to be related to those dead zones we talked about. So we're seeing a smaller dead zone than we have before. Improving water clarity, we have seen an improvement in that. So you might look at the water in the bay and you think it's a little murky. I don't consider that really good water clarity, but there is sunlight penetrating through enough to get to the bottom. So it is actually a slight improvement with water quality, which is great. And then we also have in the pollution category toxics. So this is going to be more related to things like litter and trash, those non-point source pollutants that we talked about. And that's always kind of been the same over the last few years in this report. Again, that's going to come down to a lot of legislation and regulating companies and organizations to not pollute in certain areas. But that's what our pollution indicators look like. And then we have our habitat indicator scores. So that's broken up into 4 categories. We have our forest buffers. So a lot of trees and grasses along our marshes are extremely important. They absorb a lot of flooding. They can also absorb a lot of nutrients, so that prevents them from going in the wetlands. So we need a lot of vegetation. And we're seeing less of that over time. Some of that was due to a lot of storm events that we've had, but also, again, some of those rollbacks in legislation. Wetlands is a pretty broad category, as you guys can see here, but our wetlands have really not changed their score in the last few years as well. Again, it's really hard to map wetlands. They change a lot, and especially they have a lot of tidal changes. So it can be difficult to give wetlands a really accurate score at times because they are very massive. Underwater grasses or seagrasses in the bay are extremely important and iconic here in the Chesapeake Bay. We're seeing a decline in those because of water temperatures increasing. They're actually cold species. They tolerate cold temperatures. And so if you have rising temperatures, it affects seagrasses. And also if you have excess sediment in the water, really cloudy water, sunlight's not able to penetrate down and get to those seagrasses. And that's happening in certain areas in the bay. But there's a lot of great restoration efforts for our seagrasses underway. And then resource lands. So that applies to lands like our forests and our farming areas. So those have kind of stayed the same as well. We're still trying to maintain those lands as much as possible in our watershed. And then finally, we have our fishery indicators. This is where that question came in about our menhaden, and so our rockfish is a species, a fishery here. Rockfish are also called striped bass, and they are a very iconic species, but their population has suffered quite a bit over time. A lot of their spawning activity has come to a halt. Their menhaden population, the fish that they eat, that population has suffered too. So the striped bass has suffered as well. So that's something that they've been trying to really, really focus on in the Bay report. Our oysters and blue crabs, they're up points, which is great. There's a lot of restoration projects and a lot of awareness going on for those 2 species. So we're seeing a lot of help when it comes to our oysters and blue crabs. But it tends to be our fish get overlooked, also like our shad here. So they used to be a really, really important fishery in the Chesapeake Bay, not so much anymore. And they tend to swim upriver into freshwater areas, and a lot of the dams in the area can cause them to not be able to spawn or return back to the areas where they need to go, and they have to find a new river to go up. So even though dams play good purpose, sometimes they do affect some of these fish species. So before I move on, do you guys have any questions about any of those indicators? I know I kind of just briefly touched on them. Okay, so I'll move on to ways that we can help. So it's not always doom and gloom. There's always a light at the end of the tunnel. So the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is doing some great things. They have two different programs going on. They have their Making History campaign. So this is really working on restoring the forest buffers along wetlands and the oysters, because those are two natural filters. So of course we know trees are great filters, but our oysters also can filter water and create nice, clean, fresh, good water. So that really focuses on those two things, whereas the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint, that is going to be more political focused. So they're trying to get all 6 of the states, including DC, in the watershed to help pull together and try to target pollution issues. So holding companies accountable for their actions and teaching these companies how to dispose of their waste properly on a level playing field. So getting all 6 states to play at the same time. And there's so many other organizations in this area that are doing projects like this to help. So I have those listed down there. And that's not even half of them. There's so many in the Chesapeake Bay. This is just even the lower half of the Chesapeake Bay. All of these places are doing things and projects to help make the bay a more beautiful place and continue to enjoy it for future generations. But I did want to throw some projects out there that you guys as a group could do, or with your family or your friends. So if we're talking about things like Oyster Projects, so they have a couple, there are more out there. These are just some that I was able to find. So they do an oyster gardening volunteer program through the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And you go through training and you learn how to identify oysters, bag them, and plant them. And so you'll go around a local community and you can help build up these oyster reefs. So if you're not able to do that kind of volunteer work, if it's too much of a commitment, it can be things just in your everyday life, from eating those sustainable seafood options. So supporting Virginia seafood. They have a website that really gives you a lot of great options for some of those local fisheries in the area. And then the Rice River Center over in Richmond, they have an oyster shell recycling program. So once you've eaten your delicious oysters, instead of just throwing them out, they have a website that you can go to, and they have various ways that you can either drop off your shells at these locations, and they'll use those shells to either build up oyster reefs, because oysters need something hard to stick to grow into a reef, or they'll use it for things like we've seen the pavement along coastal areas that is made up of ground up oyster shells. So it's all about repurposing the oyster shells after we've used them. If you're more into doing grass plantings, for example, so this image here shows these folks are planting Spartina, that cordgrass, in these living shorelines. In the James River Association, they do a living shoreline volunteer work program where you get to go out to local areas that are in need of vegetation along the shoreline, and you plant Spartina in these, they call them bald spots, along these coastal areas. So that's one thing to do. There's not a lot when it comes to seagrass plantings. That's mainly done through VIMS. Our scientists are the ones that really do that. So it's hard for volunteers to really get into that. But these are definitely some great opportunities to do with some local organizations in the Chesapeake Bay. And then the Clean the Bay Day coming up. I know you guys mentioned that you'll be working at this event, but this is also hosted by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And this year it is a virtual experience, and they are asking people to register and conduct some sort of cleaning up of litter and trash in an area. So local area, I believe they have a list of places that you could go to and meet up with people to do a cleanup. You can also do it at any place you want, as long as you have permission. And so I put the website on here if you guys want more information on that day. I have not been to a Chesapeake Bay Day yet, so I'm excited to participate this year. And hopefully next year I might even get to see you guys out at the actual event in person. But lots of cool things that they're doing over those 6 days for sure. And then in our everyday life as well, there's even more ways that we could do, and I'm sure you have probably done many of these. I have. You can join local organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and they send you newsletters and emails regarding ways to get involved and updates on what they're doing. I love to write letters to my local representatives and asking for their support in eco-friendly legislation, or even attending town hall meetings or public meetings with your local government where that's allowed. I don't know, with COVID, it's a little iffy these days. Writing letters to local newspapers and magazines to include stories that focus on some of these issues, especially events like Clean the Bay Day. And of course, I love just everyday choices like carpooling when possible, or riding a bike if you can, reducing your use of like single-use plastic items. And I love to support my local businesses when I can, especially when it comes to those seafood choices. You know, buying them from a local waterman or a local fisheries is always a good thing to do. Yeah, so when it comes to issues in the Bay, I know a lot of it seems a little doom and gloom, but you know, management is always key, and education. So being able to identify the issue and brainstorm solutions and figure out ways to implement them. And, you know, sometimes some of those solutions, it's not going to work the first time. So it's a lot of trial and error, but a lot of great places are doing a lot of great things to ensure our bay stays healthy. And I love seeing the general public show interest and wanting to get involved as much as possible. And none of these places would be anything without their volunteer groups. So they definitely value those programs. And whenever you can get involved is always a great thing, even if it's every now and then. It's definitely great to support your local community. And I included the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's information if you had any more questions about the Health of the Bay report or some of their programs. I don't work for them, so I don't want to speak too much for them, but definitely they are a great resource, a great company. So I have some of their general contact information for you guys in these. So if you ever want to touch base with them or find out more, they have plenty of resources. But yeah, I want to thank you guys. I really enjoyed speaking with y'all tonight and talking about Chesapeake Bay and some of the issues, but also some of the ways that we can help in the future. And I will find, now that I'm thinking about it, the VIMS off-spray camera. But if you guys had any other questions, I would love to answer those.
Yeah, I have another question here. You mentioned global warming is going to have an effect on the bay. Increased carbon dioxide levels, would that make the ocean or the water more acidic because of more dissolved CO2, or will the higher water temperatures cause more of the dissolved gases to come out of the water?
Yeah, it's kind of a mix of both at the same time, which is what's a little dangerous, because, you know, even though the ocean is a carbon sink and it can absorb excess carbon in the ocean itself, we also see the carbon cycling down. We call that carbon sequestration. I can't speak today, but it floats down in this stuff called marine snow, and it breaks down and it floats down to the bottom of the ocean, and you see thick layers of basically organic carbon that a lot of fish will feed off of. So it is a good thing to have carbon in our ocean. But again, you know, you have that tipping point. So if the ocean's absorbing too much from the atmosphere, it's not going to be able to process through the natural ocean cycle of carbon. And so you do see acidic levels going up, and that causes harm to a lot of shellfish species. And it can also affect dissolved oxygen too if you have extreme water temperature changes. But the warming temperatures more have to do with, certain species having to go elsewhere. So if it's too warm, like our seagrasses, for example, they cannot tolerate really, really warm, sustained temperatures. So if it's too warm, and they can't migrate really, seagrasses are pretty stationary, so they will really suffer when it comes to that. But it is kind of a balance. So carbon and water temperature, as long as it doesn't, tip the boat, our ocean can tolerate it. But if it's for a long period of time, it can definitely be a strain on our ocean.
So Tara, I wanted to thank you so much for an enjoyable and informative talk. This is certainly a great way to kick off Earth Week and also our annual focus on the Chesapeake Bay health.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find this live cam for y'all.
Also,
I actually found it, Tara, and I just put it in the chat for everybody.
Perfect. Awesome.
one other thing about the shells, eating oysters, the James City County has an oyster shell collection. I know it's on Tuning Road. I'm not sure it's on Jolly Pond. And I think a lot of restaurants, participate. I don't know if they go to VIMS or they go to VCU, but because, that River Rice Center is a bit of a hike. So
Yeah, I think their website, if you were to go to the center is located in Richmond, but the website, I believe, lists different shell drop-off areas that aren't in Richmond. So I think you can pick your city that you're in the James River or the York River area, and they can tell you the closest place that you can go. And yeah, I know a lot of restaurants will take them as well. VIMS used to be a collection site. I don't know if we still are because of COVID, because our campus is technically closed to the public. So it might be different, but they do a good job of updating their website about places that are accepting oyster shells and people who can come in person. It's just VIMS is a little, they don't want COVID. They're just very no one can come.
Tara,
I
do
can tell you where one of the sites, because I just dropped it off a couple days, Sunday. It's a part of the William and Mary campus there where the baseball field is. And there's some soccer fields and a bunch of old buildings.
Oh, perfect.
The road, if you get, that's what road is that? That's not Old Town Road, is it? Ironbound. If you turn on to Ironbound, like if you're going up Long Hill, I think turn on or Ironbound, and the baseball field, the William and Mary baseball field is on the left. Just past the baseball field, there's like a little alley that gets you back into the parking lot for that baseball field. And if you go down that alley and then take a right and go in front of all the old buildings, at the very end of that road where it dead ends, that's where there's a big oyster dump. And I was just there, and I think that's where most of the restaurants must dump now, because it was pretty full.
Yeah, and that's probably a good area. So there are a lot of restaurants around, especially around Ironbound. So yeah, and I'm not sure exactly. I'm sure it's someone from the Rice River Center who comes and collects those shells and distributes them to the places that are going to recycle them or use them for oyster projects. Like VIM will take them in, and we use those oyster shells to build artificial reefs using concrete, these concrete balls, and we stick the shells in there so it gives the oyster something to stick to. So yeah, I haven't seen that one though. I'll definitely have to check that site out.
And Tara, do you have any idea what percentage of oyster shells get recycled? I mean, how much of a problem is it? Or
that is a good question. I could not guess, actually. I don't imagine it's more than 30-40%, to be honest. Probably restaurants are going to be much better about it than, a family sitting at home, just because they will produce a lot more of them. where it's just kind of easier for people. If they have like a couple dozen, they can just toss them. But a restaurant is probably going to look more into, disposing of them in a way like recycling them. But that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that.
Like you say, restaurants go through a lot more than individuals. And so I'd probably be willing to go by restaurants and pick them up if they're not willing to do it themselves. But
Yeah. Mhm.
hopefully a lot of them are doing it.
And I've seen places where you go pick up your oysters and they give you another bag and it's labeled your like recycling bag. And so you put your oyster shells in there when you're done and just drop them back off where you picked up your oysters. That was down in North Carolina though, but I'm sure there's something like that, especially down here in the Bay. That's a good one. I'll have to look that up.
And I'm just going to do a flagrant promotion for June's Clean the Bay Day. I'm responsible for organizing that. And the website basically says you have to wait till I think the 29th or 30th of April when they open up, and I'll see if, so it almost sounds like you're on your own. I was hoping there might be some like county or city park sponsors like we did the last time. I know I work for the National Park Service, and I'm not so sure we're gonna do it, to allow groups, but.
Yeah, it said on there that they had like a list of places that people could go. Yeah, but yeah, it's very like hands off this year. It's very much like whatever you want to do. If it's your backyard, that's fine. And I know there's ways that you can like share photos and videos of the work that you're doing for the Bay. You can share it through their like Instagram handles and tags and stuff. But yeah, I was really hoping to see what a big Clean the Bay Day would look like. So hopefully next year.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of groups, and they, from last year, and most of them are, they have to re-register to become active. And I think that's
I see.
the end of April. It sounds to me like that's when things will start happening. But
Yeah.
I mean, we've done it a couple times as a church. We've gone to York River State Park and to, what's the one, Rebecca? Waller Mill. We did
Okay.
Waller. Yeah, it was fun. It was good.
Yeah, I know we usually go because York River State Park is one of our partners. So for Clean the Bay Day, I know that's where we normally go for like a booth setup. But yeah, I mean, I was gonna do a little cleanup in my apartment complex or somewhere nearby, but I'm glad you guys are still able to participate though.
Well, we're calling out anybody who's on this Zoom meeting. We're going to do it safely, and I think a lot of us have had our shots now, so
it's good.
That helps.
Yeah.
I've got one quick question. Are you familiar with Chesapeake Bay Field Station? It's up on Wallops Island. They have people who seem to do a job much like yours, and that wondered if there was cooperation and trying to work together to accomplish more for both.
Where is it located? It sounds very familiar.
I think it's on Wallops Island up in Maryland, or would that be Maryland? Anyway, it's right across from it's right across the connector to Chincoteague and Acidification, and they have summer programs for kids and for adults and people who do teaching, and have boats that go out and do collecting things and keeping records.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if there was any cooperation between your group and theirs, since they seem similar but in slightly different areas, but still all related.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm still learning the ropes with like people we've worked with, because I've been here right when COVID started. So I haven't been able to experience our full partnerships with everyone. It's very familiar. And there are a lot of places who are either more like ecotourism thrive, so they will like take people out on boats, or they do volunteer work with the public, like the James River Association. There's lots of little nonprofits like that all over the place. We aren't partnered with them just because they are not like really close by, I guess.
Right.
Like the York River State Park, we're partnered with because they are, you know, right down the
there,
road.
yes.
But I know my boss has definitely worked with people up there. And I know we go up there on the boats to that area to look at seagrasses. There is a lot of seagrass population up that way. So they will do a lot of transects. They'll lay out little transects and actually measure the seagrass in that area because they actually have a really healthy seagrass population further up north. So if that's the area, I think that's where I'm hearing it from, is our seagrass scientist. She goes up there on the boat sometimes. But yeah, there's lots of great little environmental organizations all over the place, which is great because that means our reach can reach a lot more people.
So are your boats different than VIM's boats, or do y'all all use the same boats, or?
So our boats are VIM's boats. They're a little different. We have our little logo on there too. If a lot of our boats are pretty small, but when we do need to take a longer trip, we're allowed to take a VIM's boat, which is going to be a lot more comfortable. It's not just a skiff, so we can go a lot longer on one of the larger boats. But yeah, we have about 5 or 6 boats that we use, but VIM's has like 40 different types of boats. So they're very lucky, and we're very lucky to be partnered with VIM's because we have a lot of great resources that I know a lot of places don't have. So I'm extremely grateful for a lot of the opportunities that we get and a lot of the resources that are available to us. So it's great. I love being on the boat. Can't beat it.
Well, thanks again, Tara. Thanks to all for tuning in. Thanks for moderating, Rebecca, and recording. I appreciate that.
And you guys have my slides. So if you need any of that information for those projects or links, they're all there. So yeah, I want to thank you guys again.